Shalom and welcome to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Thank you very, very much for joining us. And what I promise will be a very, very interesting and enlightening conversation with a returning guest, Connie Zweig. If you would like to make a comment or a suggestion for us, please feel free to email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. Visit the website, jewishsacredaging.com, and we welcome Connie back. Connie Zweig, a retired Jungian therapist, author of numerous books, but specifically what we want to focus on a little bit right now is the revision, revitalization, second generation of Romancing the Shadow and Meeting the Shadow. Connie, welcome back. How are you? Nice to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
Well, so the shadow, and you're a Jungian therapist. You spent your life with this. So for somebody who perhaps missed that class in college or hasn't read Jung or your books, what do you mean by this shadow thing?
The shadow is that part of us that is not in the light of awareness. It's the part that we keep hidden from ourselves and from others because of the messages we received as kids, whether from parents or grandparents or clergy or school teachers or peers. We got these messages about what's okay, good behavior, and what's not, what's bad, what's taboo, unacceptable, and shameful. And as we grow up, we develop a conscious personality that carries those positive qualities, and what's not acceptable gets hidden in the shadow. I like to say it's like a dark room in which our feelings and dreams and images lie hidden. And then with shadow work, we begin to develop those images and see them again. So what seems to me to be happening now, Richard, is this resurgence in interest in shadow work, which is why the publishers wanted to redesign and add new writing to Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow so that they were updated to what's happening now. Because today we're seeing shadow coming out of the closet in all kinds of ways, behaviors and speech that would never have been acceptable before is now on the world stage. And our government, tragically, has weaponized shadow projection. So what do I mean by that? If we unconsciously we attribute to other people, individuals or groups, those traits that are not acceptable in ourselves, then we see them outside of ourselves. And we meet the shadow in the other. We create us and them. We've seen this in Israel and Palestine for millennia now. We see this as the root of every war, of every genocide, of every Holocaust, of every occasion of slavery. We see that there's this demonization of other people. And that makes it okay to treat them with cruelty. And so now we're seeing that with xenophobia, with anti-immigrant sentiment. And it's all about shadow projection. We're seeing it in anti-Semitism. We're seeing it in sexism. We're seeing it in ageism. We're seeing it in racism. Every one of these, really challenging global issues is rooted in shadow projection. And when you start to see that as a filter, when you start to see through that insight into what's happening on the world stage, you realize that this psychological mechanism is what is creating the tribal mentality, the us and them, the enemy making, and so many of our problems.
Is this sense of projecting, in other words, from I'm hearing you correctly, this resurgence of shadow work, as you call it, may be the projection of my own dark side, if I can use that term, onto other people as a defense mechanism.
Yes.
In other words, does this projection out of the fear of
Yes.
the other, it's really because it's part
It's
of me.
keeping us from looking at those qualities in ourselves. And in that way, it's defending and protecting us. And the psyche is just built that way because the nature of the shadow is to hide. And there are several ways in which we can encounter it consciously. One is in dreams. One is in humor, like sarcastic, cruel slips of the tongue humor, right? Another is in projection, in which we, maybe we go to a party and we've never met this person, but we say to ourselves, she's so seductive, or he's so aggressive. And we don't know anything about them really as individuals, but we're attributing something in ourselves that we can't accept onto other people. And so we're meeting, we meet the enemy and it is us. We're meeting an aspect of ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean that the other person isn't seductive or aggressive or lazy or mean or whatever the quality. It doesn't mean that because the target might fit. So we're not saying there's necessarily innocence on the other side of the projection. But what we're saying is that when we start to become aware of this mechanism and of how we meet our own shadow material, we can begin to reclaim some of those things that we're giving away to others, unknowingly giving away to others. And we can begin to contribute less to the darkness in that way and find more common ground in our humanity. We can't do that when we're engaged unconsciously in shadow projection. Like, say, Russia and Ukraine right now. We can't do that unless we actually start to take apart what is the root in the psyche, what is the root of that war and that enemy making.
You mentioned before a couple of minutes ago, and to some this would be a very controversial conversation, but you used the phrase weaponization of the shadow.
Weaponization of shadow projection. Yes.
Walk me through that. What do you mean by that? Because it's very dangerous. And go ahead.
So many of us were alarmed when Donald Trump started running for office because his language was so biased and unempathic. The way he spoke about women, the way he spoke about people of color, the way he spoke about other cultures and other countries. His arrogance about what he could do and nobody else could do, and the complete lack of compassion or empathy for others. The ageism about Biden. And so he packaged that impulse that's universal in everyone. The impulse to do name calling, the impulse to separate ourselves, to feel superior, to be tribal, to be part of a group that then makes other groups lesser or other from us. All of that is in all of us. But he has proudly, without shame, spoken it out loud for many years now. And what happened is he attracted other people who have that same mechanism going on and gave them permission for the first time in their lives to be openly racist or openly sexist or openly hostile to other religions or other groups. So he created this permission structure now for millions of people to do that. I think he had 70 million votes. And now that he's in office again, he's organizing the government around that mechanism. So he's disempowering poor people. He's disempowering older people. He's disempowering other cultures where there's terrible poverty and hunger. All because of shadow projection.
So and again, from your work and your writing and the conversations, this is not genetic, this is family of origin based?
Well,
In other words,
that's a perennial question in psychology that I can't answer. What's genetic and what's environmental? Nature, nurture. What I can say is, with him, he has a severe personality disorder. And we know he was very abused. And we know there are other members in his family who've talked about, the situation in which he was raised. Is there something genetic about psychopaths or sociopaths? Probably. So we're not blaming parents. That's not the point here. The point from my work, 30 years of clinical practice, part of what I saw was shadow material is inherited like eye color throughout the generations. So there's multi-generational shadow issues that are carried on, grandparents, parents, kids, grandkids. And not necessarily about content, beliefs, or dogma or things like that, but psychology. The psychology, the behavior patterns, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental illness, mood disorders, whether it's, and it could also be biases. Like if you're really raised in a racist family and that's okay with everybody, chances are you're going to internalize that. And then you may be educated and realize what's going on and have some choice. And you may choose or not choose to participate in that. But there's an unconscious transmission that goes on, just like in Holocaust survivor families. There's unconscious transmission of certain anxieties and uncertainties and fears that goes on that people don't talk about, that people aren't aware of. And so, and part of what's happening now, because of all this polarization, is there are many families that are divided because there are right-wingers and left-wingers in the same family. And they can't speak to each other. And they project all over each other. He's so stupid. She's so woke, whatever it is, right? So how do you build those bridges? How do you connect? How do you feel the humanity in one another?
So if you're using the concept of the shadow, which you do, I guess the next obvious question is, based upon your clinical practice, your writings, your understanding, your speaking engagements, etc., how in the world do you begin to shed light on the shadow?
So in meeting the shadow and romancing the shadow, I explore how this unconscious material gets formed, how it erupts and sabotages our intentions in life, like repetitive fights in relationships, as an example, or addiction, or procrastination, or the critic, or whatever it is, and how it erupts, and then what we can do about it. So romancing the shadow focuses on relationships, and my method of shadow work, how we begin to detect when a particular aspect of the shadow, which I call a shadow character, begins to emerge from the darkness, from the unconscious, into awareness, into behavior, into speech. Okay? So I made this discovery that kind of blew my mind, which is that each shadow character has the same repeating thoughts, repeating feelings, repeating bodily sensations within us. So let's say it's the critic. Oh, she's always criticizing her husband. She wants to stop. She doesn't know why she's doing it. Every time that happens, she says the same thing to herself. Maybe it's, if only he would dress differently, right? If only he would eat differently. And she has the same feelings that go with that. It could be disgust. It could be disappointment. She has the same bodily sensations. Let's say her solar plexus gets queasy or her shoulders get tight. Once she can begin to catch one of those cues, she can become aware that the critic is emerging. And then she gives it a name. We're saying the critic. And then she gives it an image in her mind. And then she's personified this as a figure rather than trying to deal with this giant amorphous shadow that has, nothing you can hold on to, right? Because the shadow is infinite. We're not going to make all of the shadow conscious ever. But we can with the critic that is harming our relationship and sabotaging our intimacy. So as an example, she begins to detect every time she has that feeling, let's say, of kind of aversion to her husband or what he's wearing or what he's eating, whatever the behavior is, she's going to blurt out something critical. So she has a moment in which she can choose, do I want to do that again? I know the consequences. He's going to be hurt and we're going to be distant. And she can make a different choice. Now, each of these shadow characters is created in our early lives for a reason. They have a valid need inside them. And she can discover that the critic maybe is creating distance with her husband unconsciously because she doesn't know how to consciously create some space for herself. So she's doing it unconsciously. Rather than saying, you know what, I need a day to myself. I need some time off. I need some quiet time, whatever and an I statement, rather than creating some space with a constructive communication, she's just putting him down and sending him off. So there's a valid need in there.
I'm wondering, because I want to ask you this question, because you just alluded to something before. And, our tradition puts a lot of stock on the intersection and the interconnection of body and mind. And so in doing the shadow work, how much of this, as you work with clients, as you work with individuals, that is manifest through you, because you alluded to this a moment ago, in feelings in the body, like when I enter this, my stomach gets upset. I get headaches, and it has nothing to do with your GI system, but it has everything to do with the shadow and where it is. Am I in the right direction? Well,
that's so
here?
Interesting. When Freud and Jung were first kind of exploring the unconscious, like pioneers on the moon 100 years ago, right? Nobody knew anything about this. They thought it was like a little corner in the head, right? It was like a closet in the brain somewhere. Now we know brain, mind, body is all functionally connected. It's all acting together. It's all connected by peptides and hormones, and everything is working together. So shadow content is in the body. It's in our muscles. It's in our cells. It's not in a little corner of the brain somewhere. And so you can work with shadow work through the body. And for people who are very kinesthetic or body-centered, they can use their bodily cues to recognize the shadow character. For me, I'm more auditory. It's easier for me to recognize the inner talk, the self-talk. For somebody else who's more of a feeling type, it's easier to recognize the repeating feeling. So there are these three kind of ways in to connecting with a shadow character.
It's just to me fascinating that we still don't, in popular education or school, we just don't really I don't know whether it's we don't understand it. We just don't seem to teach this, that all of this is so interconnected. And I know Maimonides, when he was writing because he was a practicing physician
Yes.
in the 11th century, or 12th century, he wrote about this. He said, that when you go to the doctor, the first thing the doctor should be doing is talking about your psychological framework before you get to the physical ailment, because that's really what may be going on. And it's why this stuff is so fascinating and interesting.
Yeah. Well, this body-mind split is really deep in Western culture. It's not in every indigenous culture, but in postmodern Western Eurocentric culture, there is this body-mind split. Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? And it's also true in most religious traditions that there is this sense of the spirit versus the flesh. And so part of what's happened is the body goes into the shadow and bodily functions become taboo. And you grow up and you learn, about being in the bathroom, close the door, nobody wants to see, touching yourself, no, 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 feeling sexual feelings, no, 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 bad, bad, right? And so there's a lot of shadow associated with the body. And you're right, that has not come into awareness. Now, integrative medicine and functional medicine is trying to focus more on the body-mind connection. But it's not so much in treatment, it's more about alternative treatments rather than actually, as you say, working with the mental health.
Yeah, it's just because in our tradition, we actually have a bathroom blessing, whose theology is quite profound. You basically say, "Hey, thank you, everything's working," because if we understand, if the stuff isn't working, we have a problem there. And it's just, here's something that comes up in before that, the whole concept of, again, from the textual tradition in Genesis, Jacob and Esau and the wrestling, and Jacob's identity changed with a different name. He has wounded, and he emerges with a different name. Psychology 101, you're wounded, and you emerge with a different identity. Talk to me about how this concept of wrestling impacts or is impacted by what you call the shadow work.
I think that's a beautiful story about wrestling with the shadow, with his shadow, and beginning to take it in and be transformed so that it's a rite of passage. He emerges with a new name. He emerges in a new stage of life with a new identity after wrestling with the shadow. And, that experience, I'll give you an example from my own life. So before I had gone back to grad school to get my doctorate, before I had written any of these books, I worked in the book publishing world. And one year at New Year's, I gathered some friends around me and I asked them, sitting in a circle, how did you experience me this year? And 5 out of 6 of them said, you're too judgmental. So that was a profound reflection for me. And I didn't have the language of shadow work, but I knew that I had to wrestle with that demon, right? I had to wrestle with that part of me so that I could have a different quality of connection with people. And for several years, I called it the judge. And for several years, I could identify it, observe it, and notice the consequences of being judgmental about people. That I would feel superior and therefore distant, disconnected from people, and treat them, not as equals. And I began to feel the heartbreak about that, for how long I had been doing that and where it came from in terms of my relationship with my parents and all that. And as that changed, my whole connection with the people I met kind of leveled out. There was this equalizing, humbling, and equalizing, and my heart opened. And I should have gotten a new name, because it felt like I was starting another stage of life. And many people have reported this kind of experience to me with this work, regardless of whatever shadow character they work with. It could be a foodie that they've never been able to tame, right? It could be a tyrant where they're controlling in their relationship. It could be a racist that comes from family patterns that they're ashamed of, but they recognize by their inner dialogue that it's still there, right? And when you really change your relationship with that part that's been hidden and you bring it into awareness and you start to welcome it little by little, and it's not easy, right? It wasn't easy for me to face the judge, but little by little, you start to welcome this part. You're changed. You're transformed from this work, and your relationships change.
Yeah, it's very much, again, as you're talking, I'm thinking of biblical images of the binding of Isaac and some of the modern interpretations of the fact that last month was Passover, that so many of us are still enslaved and trying to loose the bonds that bind us, which I guess in a Torah or religious point of view could be another way of saying shining light on the shadow and understanding what this is part of who we are. I mean,
yes, because we are enslaved by the unconscious process. I think of that during Passover. There's a part of all of us that is trapped or controlled by these internal dynamics and not freed up to be fully authentic, not freed up to feel the full range of emotion because so much has been stuffed. But creative expression, because, very positive things can go into the shadow, Richard. If you're growing up in a family that says, you're going to go to work and make money, that's all that matters. But you want to learn, and you're a star student, but you're not going to have the support for that. That talent and that dream is going to go into the shadow. Or you want to be a musician, but that's not supported. It's going to go into the shadow. So often we see at midlife, when people kind of crash their lives and leave their careers and their marriages because some other part of themselves is bursting out. That's the shadow.
Yeah, you can only repress it for and as you probably talk to people in your office, and every clergy person I know has done in their pastoral counseling work, you can only repress this for so long until you get sick. And the sickness will manifest itself in a variety of some acting out and some rejection or some depression or whatever. And every clinician, clergy has said, well, yes, I had this in my office. This person, 48 years old, all of a sudden said, I'm tired of being the corporate lawyer. I wanted to paint. And now there are obviously economic concerns about living that, but more and more people seem to be able to now, I guess this is why you're revising these books, are coming to grips with life is very short. I may be granted longevity, but I got to do this because I've always wanted to do it.
Yeah. I think the pandemic made people more aware of mortality.
Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
And especially us baby
100.
boomers, but other people as well, other
Yeah.
generations too. And that's left people feeling they want self-knowledge. They want meaning. They want purpose. And, what makes me so happy about these new additions is that new generations will find shadow work. That younger people will now be able to reflect, be more self-reflective, have the tools they need, right, to explore what's in their shadow, have the tools they need to understand what's going on in the political arena, which is all about the shadow. And that's in meeting the shadow. Or at work, let's say there's a difficult relationship at work, also a section about that in meeting the shadow. Or in their intimate relationship, why are we having the same repeating fight? It's so stupid. Why are we doing that? It's all about romancing the shadow and getting these tools and practices, which we're not given in school. No, we're not given anywhere. We're not given in synagogue and church. We're not given at home. So getting these practices can be really life affirming.
So before we run out of time, I got to ask you one question because this comes up every once in a while, which is an understatement in many of the classes that we teach from Jewish Sacred Aging. Is part of the shadow, and I apologize, I may not be framing this correctly, is part of the shadow, especially as we get older, the awareness of our own death anxiety, the reality of our own mortality, and how that plays out.
So the definition of what's in the shadow is that it's unconscious. So I would say collectively, death has been in the collective shadow, right? We haven't talked about it in this culture. We don't have, our rites are all very private. There's no public display like there is in other cultures. I was in India and the cremations are out in the open and everybody's seeing the burning bodies. So we have a funeral, but there's only the family there. And, in some families it's talked about and in some families it's not. So now I think part of what's happening with our generation is there's more openness to mortality awareness. And some of that is because so many of us have spiritual practices. So whether it's Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism, Buddhism, Vedanta, shamanism, in these lineages, there are practices for facing death. And for me, I've been meditating every day for more than 50 years. And I always remember as I follow my breath that this could be my last breath. So that's been a practice for a long time. In the inner work of age, which extends shadow work into midlife and beyond. So for boomers who want practices in shadow work about aging, like meeting your inner ageist, for example, there's the theme throughout the book. One of the themes is mortality awareness, because that is a practice now that we all need to hold and ask ourselves on a regular basis, what do I want to do with the time remaining?
Yes, that's the
Who
spiritual
do I want
question.
to be with the time remaining? What are my highest values? What is the meaning with the time remaining? So that I don't feel regret on my deathbed. And that's a practice that's really important. And it brings out of the shadow. So what's in the shadow around that? Fear, anxiety, shame, right? Guilt. What if you haven't given and received forgiveness? as much as you could. So there's an anticipatory anxiety about dying without that, and about feeling regret as you die. So these are practices that are really connected to shadow work.
Connie, thank you very much. This is, again, touching the tip of the iceberg here on some very, very, very complex issues. Once again, the revision out now of Romancing the Shadow and Meeting the Shadow available, Connie, right? All the usual suspects, and both in bookstores and electronically. Connie, thank you very, very much. Good luck with the revisions. Good luck with the speaking.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime. It's great. Good luck with everything. Just
You
stay
too.
healthy too. Stay healthy. Give a wave to Marina Del Rey for
You
me
too.
too. As we were talking before, a lovely,
Thank you,
lovely
Richard.
place. To all of you, thank you very, very much for joining us on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Again, I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Please visit us at the website, jewishsacredaging.com. If you'd like to support our work, there is a conveniently located donate button there. If you or your organization would like to be a sponsor of several of these podcasts, again, just email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. We'll take it from there. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the broadcast centers of Lubetkin Media Companies in beautiful Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And a big shout out to our producer, Steve Lubetkin, and he and Judy's new grandson, Thomas, who is right now probably figuring out how to work all those buttons and dials, even though he's less than a year old, but that's okay. He's a genius. Thank you again. We appreciate your time for being with us. Till we see each other again, please stay healthy. And most of all, especially in this day and age, be kind to one another. Shalom. Todah.